It starts the same way it usually does. A file waiting on the screen, no priority marker, no sense of urgency attached to it. Grimm is already half a step away from the table, pretending to stretch his back, pretending not to care. He glances at the file name, then quickly looks somewhere else, and lets out a quiet comment about how some planets remember people better than people remember planets, and how those are usually the ones that cause paperwork to linger. He says it lightly, almost joking, like saying it out loud might stop it from meaning anything. Mara does not play along. She moves closer instead, rests one hand on the console, and starts scrolling immediately. Not fast, not slow, just enough to make the screen react. She scrolls down, back up, then sideways into the metadata, as if daring the file to hide something. I stay where I am, watching both of them, because routine reviews tend to reveal more when no one rushes to be confident. The designation itself offers no resistance. Planet 2. No warning tags, no restricted access. The environmental overview reads clean enough for standard surface movement. Gravity sits where it should. The atmosphere is listed as stable with ordinary filtration. The route referenced in the report is simple by design, chosen early to remove unnecessary variables. Same starting point, same end point, same personnel, same equipment. Nothing experimental, nothing improvised. Under normal circumstances, a file built on this level of predictability would already be closed and archived without discussion. What keeps it open is not an incident, but a sequence that refuses to collapse into a single answer. The route has been completed more than once under identical conditions. The first completion time establishes the baseline everyone expects. The second comes back longer than that, still close enough to dismiss without consequence. The third extends further again, moving in the same direction, far enough that it can no longer be ignored. There are no logs of pauses, no detours, no changes in pace. Everything else remains consistent, only the time continues to drift. Grimm stops joking, Mara stops scrolling. I leave the file open, not because I understand what this means yet, but because at this point, closing it would be an active decision to look away. I begin the review the same way I always do, from the top. Not because the opening holds answers, but because skipping steps is how assumptions sneak in. Planet 2 falls into a category we have cleared many times before. Surface gravity sits close enough to baseline that movement would feel natural, not light, not heavy. The atmosphere is listed as stable, breathable with standard filtration, no compounds that would interfere with focus or stamina. Temperature remains within a predictable range across the survey window. Nothing here would prompt concern. Nothing here would justify additional attention on its own. The route that draws our focus was not designed as a test. It was selected early as a reference path, used to verify that surface mapping, timing systems, and movement tracking were aligned correctly. A clean line, easy to reproduce, chosen because it removes interpretation. Same starting point, same end point, same distance, same elevation profile. The first traversal establishes the reference. That number is logged and accepted without comment. Later, during a routine data check, the timing appears slightly off. Not enough to suggest a fault, just enough to warrant a confirmation run. The same personnel repeat the route, using the same equipment, under the same conditions. The second completion time comes back longer than the first. The difference is noted, attributed to variance, and logged. The third traversal is not planned as an investigation, it is procedural, a confirmation of the confirmation. The route is walked again, unchanged in every way that matters. The completion time increases once more. At that point, the issue is no longer the size of the difference, but the direction. 3 runs, each one taking longer than the last without any recorded change in behavior, conditions, or execution. The repetition itself becomes the anomaly, even though no one set out to look for one. I go through the attached logs slowly. There are no pauses recorded, no stops, no detours. Checkpoint spacing remains even, indicating a consistent pace. Equipment diagnostics show stable performance across all runs. No recalibration notes, no power fluctuations. Human condition logs show nothing unusual. Fatigue remains within expected range. No reports of discomfort, distraction, or confusion. Each traversal is described in nearly identical language, as if copied forward and adjusted only where the timestamps require it. From the perspective of the people on the surface, nothing happened that felt worth explaining. By the end of the review, the shape of the problem becomes clear, even if its cause does not. The route did not change. The people did not change. The reason for repeating the route was administrative, not investigative, and yet with each repetition, the time increased. Grimm hovers near the edge of the table and makes a quiet comment about how systems sometimes notice patterns before people do, then immediately waves it off like a joke. Mara stops scrolling and leaves the timestamps where they are, because moving them again would not alter what they already show. I mark the file as incomplete, not because it lacks information, but because the information has reached the limit of what distance can resolve. Whatever is influencing these results did not announce itself. It revealed itself only through repetition. I authorize a surface visit. The file stays open, and it comes with us. The decision does not feel dramatic when it is made. It rarely does. I submit the authorization, route it through the necessary channels, and receive confirmation without delay. No objections, no escalation markers. Planet 2 does not inspire urgency on paper, and that works in our favor. Within the hour, preparations begin on the carrier. Equipment is checked, not upgraded. Supplies are loaded according to standard surface protocol, not extended stay. Grimm watches the checklist with visible relief, joking quietly about how at least we are not packing emergency gear this time. Mara says nothing. She is already verifying that the navigation and timing systems we will use match the ones referenced in the file. If we are going to compare reality to records, the tools have to speak the same language. The shuttle ride down is uneventful in the way most descents are. The planet fills the viewport gradually, surface details sharpening without surprise. No turbulence, no unexpected atmospheric resistance. Entry parameters remain stable throughout. Grimm comments on how smooth the ride feels, as if daring it to change. Mara adjusts nothing beyond what procedure requires. I monitor the instruments, not because I expect deviation, but because this is where assumptions tend to form if left unattended. Everything behaves as predicted. By the time we break through the lower cloud layer, Planet 2 looks exactly like it does in the imagery we reviewed. Familiar, neutral, the kind of place that does not announce itself. Touchdown occurs within the planned window. The landing zone is firm, level, and free of obstructions. No shift under the hull, no delay in stabilization. Once the systems confirm integrity, we disembark without ceremony. The surface feels ordinary underfoot. Gravity pulls as expected. Movement requires no adjustment. Breathing through the filter is effortless. Temperature sits comfortably within range. Grimm takes a few steps away from the shuttle, then stops, as if waiting for the ground to object. When it does not, he relaxes slightly and mutters something about how some places at least have the decency to behave. Mara begins logging environmental readings immediately, matching them against the file. The numbers align. If this were the extent of our visit, we would already be justified in leaving. We establish a temporary operational point near the landing zone, nothing permanent, just enough to stage movement and observation. The route referenced in the file begins not far from where we stand. I make a deliberate choice not to start it immediately. First contact matters less than first conditions. We spend time walking the surrounding area, getting a sense of scale, orientation, and landmarks. Nothing draws attention, no visual anomalies, no auditory interference. Equipment responds normally. Grimm grows more comfortable as the minutes pass, talking more freely, joking about how the planet seems almost disappointed by our caution. Mara continues to log, compare, and cross-check, occasionally pausing as if expecting a discrepancy that never arrives. I let this phase stretch longer than strictly necessary. If something is going to feel wrong, it usually does so early. By the time we align ourselves at the start of the route, everything about the situation suggests normalcy. Conditions match the file. The environment offers no resistance. There is no sense of anticipation beyond what comes with any procedural task. I signal readiness, not because we are about to test anything, but because we are about to repeat what has already been done before. This first traversal is not meant to reveal a problem, it is meant to confirm that the planet behaves the way it claims to. Grimm cracks one last comment about how, if this takes longer than expected, he is blaming the boots. Mara checks the timing system one final time and gives a short nod. I start the log. We begin the route the same way the others did, with no expectation that this attempt will be any different from the last one recorded. The first traversal ends without incident. We complete the route exactly as described in the file, following the same markers, maintaining the same pace guidelines, logging the same checkpoints. When we reach the endpoint, the timing comes back within the expected range, close enough that no one reacts, close enough that if this were the only run, we would already be preparing to leave. Grimm lets out a quiet breath and makes a remark about how at least the planet seems to appreciate consistency. Mara checks the timestamp once, then again, comparing it to the reference value from the file. She does not comment. I log the result and close the entry, not because it proves anything, but because it does exactly what it is supposed to do. The first traversal establishes nothing beyond confirmation. We do not repeat the route immediately. There is no reason to yet. Instead, we spend time near the endpoint, running routine checks, letting equipment cool, verifying that nothing drifted during the walk. The planet remains unresponsive in every way that matters. No shifts in gravity, no environmental changes. The ground feels the same beneath our boots as it did an hour ago. Grimm grows more relaxed the longer nothing happens, talking more freely, speculating about how this might turn into one of those rare visits where the paperwork outweighs the experience. Mara listens without engaging, her attention fixed on the console as she reconciles our readings with the archived data. Everything aligns closely enough to be reassuring. Too closely, perhaps, given what brought us here. The decision to repeat the route is not framed as a test. It is procedural, a confirmation run, justified easily within protocol. Same people, same equipment, same path. We begin again without ceremony. I keep my attention on the timing system this time, not because I expect deviation, but because this is where the file first began to resist closure. The walk feels no different from the first. Breathing remains steady, pace remains even, checkpoints arrive when they should. Nothing about the movement itself suggests resistance or delay. When we reach the endpoint, the number on the display is higher than before. Not by much. Enough to notice, not enough to provoke alarm. Grimm is the first to say something, half joking, half defensive, blaming the slightly uneven ground near the midpoint, even though we both know it was there before. Mara scrolls back through the data from the first traversal and places the two timestamps side by side. We stand there longer than necessary, looking at the numbers without touching them. The difference is small, but it is clean. No pauses logged, no deviation recorded. Equipment diagnostics report normal performance throughout. I walk back along the final stretch of the route, retracing a few steps, looking for anything that might justify the change. Nothing presents itself. When I return, Mara has already begun a third comparison, lining our second run up against the historical data from the file. The direction matches. The increase follows the same slope. That is when the tone shifts, quietly, not into alarm, but into attention. Grimm stops joking and asks, more seriously this time, whether we want to try again. I do not answer immediately. The numbers do not demand action yet, but they do invite it. I log the second traversal as complete, annotate the time difference without interpretation, and mark the entry for follow-up. We have not found proof of anything. What we have found is alignment between our experience and the pattern that kept the file open. That is enough to justify continuing. I authorize a third traversal, not as confirmation of a theory, but as confirmation of a deviation. We return to the start of the route, aware now that repetition itself has become part of the question. We do not begin the third traversal immediately. That decision is not hesitation, but routine. Before repeating the route again, we remain near the starting point longer than planned, performing tasks that do not involve movement at all. Equipment is unpacked, checked, and packed again. Power systems are cycled. Logs from the previous runs are reviewed on site instead of in transit. Grimm suggests setting up a temporary rest area, mostly as an excuse to sit down, joking that if we are going to be here anyway, we might as well let the planet get used to us. Mara does not respond verbally, but she allows the stationary period to continue. I log it as operational downtime, nothing outside procedure. Time passes without incident. The environment remains stable. Gravity does not shift. Atmospheric readings stay flat. The ground feels the same beneath our boots as it did when we landed. We talk while working, casually at first. Grim fills the silence the way he always does when waiting makes him uneasy, commenting on how standing around feels longer than walking sometimes, then laughing it off before anyone can respond. Mara continues running internal checks, comparing current readings to those recorded earlier in the day. Everything lines up closely enough to be unremarkable. If this were all that happened, the delay we saw earlier could still be written off as coincidence. The first deviation appears in something too small to matter on its own. A calibration sequence that normally completes quickly takes slightly longer than expected. No one notices it in real time. It only becomes visible when Mara pauses and looks back at the timestamp, then scrolls to the same task from earlier. The difference is minor, clean. Grim notices the pause and immediately offers an explanation, blaming stiff fingers, bad posture, anything that puts the delay back on us instead of the planet. Mara repeats the sequence without comment, standing in the same place, using the same inputs. The duration increases again, by roughly the same margin. Still nothing anyone can feel, just a number that refuses to match its earlier version. We move on. More tasks, more waiting. The stationary period stretches longer, not because we intend to test anything, but because the situation no longer feels settled enough to rush. Grim grows quieter. His jokes turn shorter, less confident, as if he is trying to keep the mood light without knowing what he is pushing against. Mara begins grouping logs differently, not by task type but by sequence. She does not explain what she is doing, but I can see the pattern forming on her screen. Actions performed once sit cleanly. Actions repeated in the same way drift slightly. The drift is small, but it is consistent. Only then do we begin the third traversal. Same route, same markers, same pace guidelines. Nothing about the walk itself feels different. Breathing remains steady. The checkpoints arrive when expected. The terrain offers no resistance. When we reach the endpoint, the timing confirms what we already suspect. Longer again. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, enough to align perfectly with the earlier increases. Grim exhales sharply and mutters something about how this is starting to feel less funny. He does not finish the thought. Mara brings up the stationary task logs and places them beside the traversal data. The slopes are not identical, but they point in the same direction. We stand there longer than necessary, neither moving nor speaking much. The realization is not fully formed yet, but it is pressing. Grim finally says something carefully, framing it as a question rather than a claim, wondering aloud whether it is really the walking that matters, or if doing anything the same way twice is the problem. He immediately undercuts himself with a joke about how he plans to start doing everything wrong on purpose just to confuse the planet. No one laughs. The suggestion lingers longer than he intended. The moment that removes doubt comes quietly. While reviewing the logs, Mara repeats a simple input command she has already used several times, standing in the same position, using the same sequence. The system responds, but the delay before confirmation is longer than it was earlier. We check the hardware. It reports clean. She issues the command again. The delay increases by the same small increment. We repeat it a third time, longer again. At that point, the room goes silent. This has nothing to do with distance, nothing to do with exertion. Staying in one place, repeating the same action is enough. I log the event without interpretation, noting only the conditions and sequence. Whatever is happening here does not announce itself through force or sensation. It accumulates quietly, attaching itself to repetition. Grim does not joke this time. Mara stops scrolling. The route is no longer the center of the investigation. The location is. I mark the next phase accordingly. We will remain in place and observe under controlled conditions. Movement is no longer required for this to reveal itself. Time is. I do not start by digging. That would already assume too much. What we know so far is limited and specific. Repetition matters, and contact with the planet seems to be part of the equation. Before looking deeper, I want to know whether the surface itself plays a role, or if what we are seeing follows us regardless of how we interact with it. The question is simple enough to test. If the ground is involved, then reducing contact should change the result. If it is not, then it should not matter where we place our equipment. Mara understands this immediately and begins assembling a temporary isolation frame using standard support struts and dampers. Nothing specialized, nothing designed to shield or block, just enough to lift a device off the ground and keep it stable. Grimm watches the process with visible skepticism, offering a quiet comment about how this feels like the kind of thing that either works perfectly or proves nothing at all. We choose a device that has already shown measurable delay during repeated use. The task it performs is simple, quick, and easy to log. First, we place it directly on the surface, exactly where it has been used before. We run the task once. The response time matches the most recent entry, slightly longer than the first time we ever ran it, consistent with the pattern. We run it again. The delay increases by the same small margin we have come to expect. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone can feel, just numbers drifting away from where they started. I log both runs carefully, making no changes to configuration or input sequence. Then we power the device down and move it onto the isolation frame. The frame holds the device less than a meter above the ground. It still sits within the same environment, the same air, the same gravity. The only difference is contact. We run the task again. The response time returns to its earlier value, closer to the original baseline. Grimm leans in, frowns, and asks if we changed anything without noticing. Mara shakes her head and runs the task a second time. The response remains consistent, no additional delay. We repeat it again, deliberately matching the sequence used on the surface. The timing does not drift, it settles. The difference is not subtle enough to argue about. The same device, performing the same task, behaves differently depending on whether it is in contact with the ground. We swap positions. The device goes back onto the surface, a short distance away from its original spot. The task is run again. The delay returns. We lift it back onto the frame. The delay disappears. We do this several times, not because we doubt the result, but because consistency matters more than surprise. Grimm stops joking entirely now, watching the transitions with an expression that suggests he would prefer a more complicated explanation. Mara begins separating the logs into two groups, labeling them only by contact state. The pattern holds across every repetition. Contact with the ground correlates with delay. Isolation does not. At this point, the problem changes shape. Repetition alone is no longer enough to describe what we are seeing. The planet is not responding to action in the abstract. It is responding through the surface. Whatever is accumulating delay does not do so uniformly. It requires contact. That contact does not have to be forceful. It does not require movement. Simply resting on the ground long enough and repeatedly enough is sufficient. I walk a slow circle around the isolation frame, looking down at the surface without really seeing it. Grimm finally speaks, carefully, wondering aloud whether the ground is acting like a medium rather than a trigger. He stops himself before finishing the thought. Mara does not respond, but she saves the dataset and flags it for priority review. I mark the conclusion narrowly, because anything broader would be speculation. The effect is not intrinsic to the device. It is not a result of repeated commands alone. It is not tied exclusively to movement or exertion. Physical contact with the planet amplifies the delay. Reducing that contact reduces the effect. That much is no longer debatable. The implication is unavoidable, even if its meaning is not yet clear. Whatever is causing this does not sit entirely on the surface, but it expresses itself through it. I do not write the word structure. I do not write the word system. I note only that the source of the effect is not environmental in the usual sense and not distributed evenly. Grim looks relieved and unsettled at the same time, muttering that he liked it better when the problem was abstract. Mara begins preparing a plan to narrow the area of influence. The next step will require us to find where this interaction is strongest. That means going down, not blindly, but deliberately. Only then will we be able to say what this planet is actually doing. Once we established that surface contact amplifies the effect, observation alone is no longer enough. The question shifts from what is happening to where it is strongest. Mara begins narrowing the area methodically, comparing delays recorded at different points across the site, marking gradients where the response time changes faster than elsewhere. The pattern does not sprawl evenly, it concentrates. Grim follows her movements with visible discomfort, keeping a careful distance from the flagged zones, making a quiet remark about how this is usually the part where someone wishes they had stayed in orbit. I transmit a preliminary report to the carrier, not as an alert, but as a request for support. We will need equipment capable of sustained contact and controlled removal. Within minutes, confirmation comes back. A recovery team is assembled. Heavy tools are prepped. The file moves from observation to action. The arrival of the equipment changes the tone immediately. What was once a small operational site becomes deliberate and focused. Stabilizers are deployed, isolation frames are expanded. We anchor the work area to prevent unintended contact spread. Grim watches the process closely, clearly relieved that someone else is now responsible for touching the ground directly. Mara oversees the placement of sensors, adjusting positions until the gradient sharpens enough to guide us. The readings point downward, not sharply, but consistently. Whatever is influencing time here is not diffuse, it is localized. I authorize excavation, shallow at first, careful and slow. There is no urgency to reach depth quickly. If the effect accumulates through contact, then haste would only complicate the data. As the excavation progresses, the readings intensify. The delay increases measurably at each new layer, then stabilizes when contact is reduced. We pause repeatedly, lifting tools, isolating equipment, confirming that what we see is not drift or error. Grim makes himself useful by tracking exposure durations, calling out when limits are reached, turning his anxiety into structure. Mara directs the dig with precision, stopping just short of where the gradient spikes too abruptly. When the obstruction finally appears, it does not resemble a natural formation. The material resists classification. It is not rock, not metal in any conventional sense, but something engineered to endure pressure and contact without degrading. The effect peaks here, then plateaus, as if this is where accumulation begins. We secure the object before attempting removal. Isolation barriers are extended, the recovery rig locks into place. Contact time is minimized, logged precisely, rotated between operators to prevent compounding effects. The extraction itself is uneventful, almost disappointingly so. The object comes free without resistance, as if it has been waiting to be lifted. Once it is fully isolated, the readings across the site begin to normalize. Delays shrink, then stop increasing altogether. We test it carefully. A device placed directly on the ground behaves as expected. Repeated actions return consistent durations. The planet, for the first time since we arrived, feels inert. Grim exhales in a way that suggests he has been holding his breath for hours, muttering that he prefers problems that stay put once you grab them. Mara runs a final sweep, confirming that the gradient has collapsed entirely. I log the intervention as successful, not because we understand what we have recovered, but because the effect is no longer active. The object is secured for transport, sealed within layered isolation, scheduled for transfer to analysis once we are clear of the surface. The file updates accordingly. The immediate issue is resolved. The route no longer drifts. Time behaves again. As we prepare to leave, I look back at the excavation site one last time. The planet offers no response, no sign that anything has changed. Whatever this was, it did not defend itself. It simply waited, recorded, and accumulated until we removed it. That silence is not comforting. It is instructive. We have solved the problem here. The question of why it existed at all remains unanswered, and it is coming with us. Once the object is fully isolated, the effect stops immediately. No gradual fade, no residual delay. Actions return to completing in the same amount of time they always did. That tells us the influence was never carried by us or by the devices alone. It required an active connection to the planet. The ground was not just a surface, it was part of the system. The structure we recovered functions as a generator, not of force, but of micro-level electrical impulses. These impulses are weak enough to be harmless and undetectable, but precise enough to interact with matter that remains in contact with the planet. When a person or an object touches the surface, those impulses are transferred and temporarily stored within the material itself, clothing, equipment, even the human body. The system does not mark identity, it marks repetition. Each time the same action is performed again, walking a route, pressing a command, adjusting a tool, the stored impulses interfere with the final phase of that action, not the movement itself, but the moment where the action completes. Muscles finish contracting slightly later. Circuits confirm completion a fraction of a second slower. Mechanical resistance increases by an amount too small to notice. The action still succeeds, it simply takes longer to finish than it did before. Because the interference operates at such a small scale, the body adapts without awareness. Humans constantly adjust to minor changes in resistance and timing. We do not feel the delay because it never arrives as a shock. It accumulates. One repetition changes nothing. The second introduces a difference too small to register. The third adds to the previous two. Over time, the ending of each repeated action drifts further away from its original timing. Machines behave the same way. They do not malfunction, they obey altered conditions with perfect consistency. This is why isolation works. When contact with the planet is reduced, the impulses cannot be transferred or reinforced. The stored interference dissipates, and actions return to their original completion time. The system does not chase, it does not project, it only interacts through physical connection. Repetition without contact means nothing to it. The intent behind the structure remains uncertain, but its function is clear. It does not test strength, speed, or endurance. It observes habit. It measures how often something is done the same way, and what happens when repetition is allowed to compound unnoticed. The planet does not slow people down directly, it slows the ending of what they repeat. We file the final report once the structure is secured. Planet 2 is reclassified as artificial, origin unknown. The surface is stable again. Time behaves as expected. The immediate problem is resolved, but the implication lingers. If a system like this exists to measure repetition rather than action, then it was never meant to be found by explorers, only by routine. The file closes. The question of who built it and why remains open, waiting for someone else to repeat the same mistake long enough to notice.